On a frigid winter evening, a lone man spotted two wolves silently pacing at the edge of his property. Instead of baring fangs or growling, these majestic yet terrifying creatures appeared desperate, pawing at his door as though pleading for refuge. When he finally opened that door, he couldn't have anticipated the life-altering moment that awaited him. What exactly did these frozen wolves want, and why would they choose a human's warm hearth over the wild they call home? Warren Pierce was no stranger to harsh winters. Having lived in the remote Alaskan countryside all his life, he was well acquainted with sub-zero temperatures and howling winds. His log cabin, sturdy and worn, stood as a testament to years of surviving in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. Yet despite his rugged experience, nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him late one snowy evening. It had been an ordinary day, or as ordinary as it could be in the dead of winter. Warren had chopped enough firewood to last the night and checked on his small vegetable greenhouse, which was kept alive by a single heater. As dusk fell, he retreated indoors, content to spend the long, dark hours by his crackling fireplace with a mug of hot tea. Then came a strange scratching at his front door, accompanied by soft whines that cut through the night's silence. At first, Warren assumed it was a stray dog, perhaps one of the few feral canines that roamed the outskirts of town. But as he peered out the frosted window, his heart began to pound. There, on his porch, stood two emaciated wolves. Their once proud coats were matted and dusted with snow, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Instead of snarling or acting aggressively, they trembled with cold and exhaustion. One of them even mustered a weak howl, as if calling for help. Warren's instincts battled with his caution. Wolves were, after all, wild predators. But these animals didn't appear menacing. They seemed desperate. Against his better judgment, Warren grabbed a flashlight and cautiously cracked open his door. The closer wolf took a shaky step forward, its glowing eyes filled not with hostility, but with a pleading intensity. In that moment, any fear he felt was overshadowed by a surge of compassion. What had driven these creatures to seek shelter from a human? And if he let them in, would his act of kindness invite danger into his home? Thus began an extraordinary encounter between a solitary man and two wild wolves. An encounter that would test Warren's resolve, challenge his preconceived notions of nature, and lead him to an outcome no one could have predicted. Warren stood at the threshold of his cabin, heart pounding as he took in the sight of the two wolves. Snow swirled around them, collecting in small drifts by his front door. The temperature had plummeted well below zero, and he could see the animals shivering under their fur. Their wide, luminous eyes seemed to plead for warmth and safety. It was a sight both mesmerizing and unsettling, wild predators begging for sanctuary. Still clutching the doorknob, Warren hesitated. Common sense dictated that inviting wolves into his home was a terrible idea. They were wild, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Yet the longer he stared into their haunted expressions, the more convinced he became that they posed no immediate threat. Their trembling bodies and weary demeanors spoke of desperation, not aggression. With a measured inhale, he made a decision. Wincing against the wind, he opened the door wider and gestured for them to come inside. The wolves exchanged a glance, if it could be called that, before cautiously padding forward, their paws leaving faint imprints in the blowing snow. The moment their fur made contact with the cabin's warmth, a shudder seemed to pass through them, as though they were finally releasing the tension they'd carried for miles in the cold. Gracefully, the pair stepped across the threshold and stopped just inside the living area. Warren, moving slowly to avoid startling them, closed the door, sealing out the howling wind. He offered a silent prayer that his instincts weren't wrong. The wolves stood still for a moment, their breaths loud in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Then, they began exploring with careful curiosity, noses to the ground, sniffing at furniture and the small pile of firewood near the hearth. Warren stood close by, silently observing. One wolf, a bit smaller, with a patch of grey fur across its back, limped slightly, favoring its right hind leg. Its ribcage was visible beneath its coat, indicating a long period of hunger. The other wolf, slightly bigger, had a scar running along its muzzle. Despite their emaciated state, they held a quiet dignity, moving without haste or panic. Warren couldn't help but feel a twinge of awe at their raw beauty. He approached the fireplace, tossing in another log to bolster the heat. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the cabin filled with a warm glow. The wolves turned their attention to the fire, one of them letting out a soft whine as it drew closer. Perhaps it was the first time they'd ever been near such a source of warmth. As the room grew cozier, Warren realized he needed to address the obvious next step: food. He rummaged through his modest pantry, pulling out some meat he'd planned to cook for himself. He wondered if feeding wolves raw cuts was wise, but given their condition, he didn't see much choice. Returning to the living area, he set down a plate of meat on the floor, then stepped back. The smaller wolf approached first, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. The larger wolf joined, and together they devoured the meal within seconds, their eyes reflecting gratitude and relief. Warren felt a pang of sympathy. How long had it been since they'd eaten? The wild was brutal, and the bitter cold made hunting nearly impossible for weak or injured animals. Once fed, the wolves seemed to relax further, their tense postures softening. Warren, still keeping a respectful distance, settled into a chair near the fireplace. He was keenly aware of the risk he was taking, but something about the wolves' demeanor reassured him. They were exhausted, possibly near death's door, and had reached a point where pride and caution gave way to survival instincts. The fact they allowed him in such close proximity spoke volumes about their desperation and their trust. The hours passed in an odd sort of companionship. Warren tended the fire, flipping through an old novel he'd read countless times, while the wolves dozed fitfully, occasionally lifting their heads at a gust of wind outside or the faint crackle of the hearth. At one point, the larger wolf whimpered softly in its sleep, paws twitching as though running in a dream. Warren felt an unexpected urge to soothe it, but he refrained, respecting the boundary between them. Night wore on, and eventually, Warren prepared a makeshift bedding area near the warmest corner of the cabin. He coaxed the wolves there, offering blankets and extra logs on the fire. They accepted, though somewhat warily, curling up with noses tucked under tails. Watching them, Warren realized he should probably get some rest himself. The day had been anything but ordinary, and fatigue weighed on him. Before turning in, he double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, an old habit in bear country. Now it seemed doubly important, given that he had two wolves inside. As he dimmed the lights and he found himself silently praying for a peaceful night, free of conflict. He couldn't help but recall stories of wolf attacks, yet his gut told him these creatures were not here to harm him. The first stirrings of dawn arrived sooner than expected. Warren awoke to the gentle glow of sunrise filtering through the frosted windows. He checked the living area, half expecting chaos or some sign of aggression, but instead he found a quiet scene. The wolves were awake, yet calm, watching him with expressions that he could only describe as weary gratitude. He stoked the fire, noticing that the smaller wolf's limp seemed worse this morning. Perhaps it had strained itself further during the night. Concerned, Warren decided to see if it would allow him closer. Moving slowly, he kneeled and extended his hand. The wolf eyed him but remained still, as though sensing he meant no harm. Gently, Warren placed his hand on the wolf's hind leg. It flinched, emitting a soft growl of pain, but didn't snap. He detected swelling, maybe an old injury or frostbite. Medical treatment would be risky, but he couldn't stand idly by. "I'll do what I can," he murmured, as if the wolf could understand. Standing, he gathered a basic first aid kit from his cupboard, mentally thanking his years in the Boy Scouts. He had no veterinary experience, but he could at least clean and bandage the wound. The real challenge would be whether the wolf trusted him enough to permit it. Watching from the corner, the larger wolf tensed, its amber eyes fixed on Warren's every move. Sensing the delicate balance of trust, Warren proceeded with the utmost caution. He knelt beside the smaller wolf, who lay trembling on the blankets, and murmured soothing words. If the wolf allowed this, he might just be able to help. If not, he'd have to back off. One wrong move could trigger the primal instinct still lurking beneath their fragile truce. The smaller wolf stared at Warren with a mix of apprehension and pain, its body quivering as if it were unsure whether to trust this human crouched before it. Warren gently patted the blankets, hoping to coax the wolf into lying still. To his relief, it let out a low whine and rested its head on its paws. The larger wolf remained close by, watching the scene intently, ready to intervene at the slightest hint of threat. Warren opened his rudimentary first aid kit, a mismatched collection of bandages, antiseptics and gauze. He hadn't used it much in the past, aside from treating the occasional scratch or blister from chopping wood. This was a different scenario entirely. He moved slowly, speaking in soft tones, aware that the smaller wolf could lash out if spooked. "Easy, fella," he murmured, placing a folded towel beneath the wolf's injured hind leg. As he dabbed antiseptic on a cotton swab, the wolf let out a faint growl, but didn't pull away. The wound wasn't deep, but it was inflamed, possibly from an earlier injury that had been aggravated by the cold and constant movement. Warren's heart clenched at the thought of how much suffering this creature had likely endured in the wild winter landscape. The larger wolf paced a few feet away, letting out a low rumble of concern. Warren glanced at it, offering a quick nod in acknowledgement. "I'm doing my best," he said, as though the wolf could truly understand. He knew it was a risk to speak aloud and draw attention to himself, but he hoped his calm tone would keep the tension at bay. After cleaning the wound and applying a light bandage, Warren carefully examined the wolf's paw pads, noticing cracks and signs of frostbite. He used a mild ointment to soothe the raw skin, before gently wrapping the leg with gauze. Throughout the process, the wolf flinched and whimpered, but remained surprisingly cooperative. Once he finished, Warren exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Done," he whispered, slowly removing his hands. The wolf exhaled through its nose, the sound almost like a sigh of relief. Warren offered a small smile, a surge of empathy welling up inside him. With the immediate medical needs addressed, Warren turned his attention to the basic matter of survival. He checked his pantry to see what remained of the food he'd given the wolves earlier. He still had enough supplies to feed them again, but his stock was limited. The realization weighed on him. If these wolves intended to stay longer than a day or two, he'd need a plan to secure more resources, something that wasn't easy during the harsh Alaskan winter. He decided to head out briefly to gather more firewood and check on potential hunting opportunities nearby. Grabbing his coat and gloves, Warren paused at the door, glancing back at the wolves. They watched him, but made no move to follow. "I'll be back soon," he said softly, as if reassuring both them and himself. Stepping outside, Warren was greeted by a stark landscape of white. The sky remained overcast, and the wind cut through his layers of clothing. He trudged through knee-high snow to the woodpile near the edge of his property, filling a sled with logs. Every so often, he scanned the horizon, half expecting to see more wolves or any sign of threatening wildlife. His mind raced with questions. Had these two been part of a larger pack? Were they outcasts? And what would happen if their pack came looking? Once the sled was loaded, Warren took a moment to survey the silent wilderness. The land was beautiful, but it also felt eerily unforgiving. He caught himself imagining the smaller wolf limping through these drifts, hungry and wounded, pushed to the brink of desperation. The thought reaffirmed his decision to help. No creature should have to endure such suffering alone. Upon returning to the cabin, Warren found the wolves lying near the fireplace. The smaller one looked to be in better spirits, occasionally licking at its bandaged leg. The larger wolf, ever vigilant, lifted its head to watch him cross the threshold. Warren unloaded the wood by the fireplace and stoked the flames, sighing in relief as the heat spread across his numb fingers. He unwrapped a portion of his remaining meat supply, placing it on a plate and setting it on the floor. The wolves approached cautiously, grateful for the meal but aware of Warren's presence. As they ate, he considered how surreal the situation was. Two wild wolves devouring his provisions within the comfort of his living room. Yet he felt no fear, only a growing bond forged through mutual survival. Hours later, the cabin had fallen into a peaceful rhythm. Warren dozed in his armchair by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The wolves rested on the blankets he'd arranged for them, rising only to lap water from a bowl he'd placed nearby. It occurred to him that he should contact someone, perhaps a local ranger or wildlife specialist, but a part of him worried that doing so might lead to the wolves being taken away or, worse, put down if deemed a threat. Conflicted, he resolved to wait another day, to see if they'd regain their strength and perhaps wander back into the wild on their own. He felt a twinge of guilt at the thought of wanting to keep them around longer. Their presence, though unusual, gave him a sense of purpose. Night fell again, and the wind howled outside. Inside the cabin, the glow of the hearth remained a steadfast beacon against the darkness. Warren, restless from the day's events, found himself pacing. The wolves watched him, their gaze quiet and understanding. It was as if they recognized his turmoil. Eventually, he sank into the chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. What would the morning bring? Would the wolves depart, returning to the life nature intended for them? Or would they linger, forging an even deeper connection to this human who had opened his heart and home? Warren couldn't be sure. All he knew was that the next few days would test his compassion, his resourcefulness, and possibly his limits. Dawn broke with a fragile light, casting a pale glow across the snow-covered land outside Warren's cabin. Inside, the warmth of the hearth enveloped Warren and his two unexpected guests. As he stirred from sleep, Warren noticed something peculiar. The larger wolf was no longer lying by the fire. A slight sense of alarm washed over him. Had it slipped out into the night? Could it have ventured back into the freezing wilderness? His concern was quickly answered by a low growl emanating from the far corner of the living room. There, standing protectively over the smaller, injured wolf, was the larger one, its ears flattened, hackles raised. It wasn't looking at Warren, however, but rather at the door. Warren's heart lurched. What had startled the wolf? Rising cautiously, he moved toward the window. Outside, in the morning's half-light, he caught sight of movement. Something was skulking just beyond the edge of his property, near the tree line. His breath fogged the cold glass as he peered out more intently. At first, he thought it might be another animal, a moose or a bear. But then, a human silhouette emerged from behind a thick pine. Adrenaline coursed through Warren. He didn't often have visitors, especially not during the harshest part of winter. Grabbing his coat and a flashlight, he pressed an ear to the door, listening for any sound. The larger wolf continued to growl, as though reinforcing the warning that someone was out there. The smaller wolf struggled to rise, whining softly. "It's all right," Warren whispered, hoping to soothe them both, and himself. He opened the door just a crack, a blast of cold air rushing in. Outside, the figure had vanished from immediate view, but footprints in the snow led around the side of the cabin. Warren stepped out, nerves on edge. The wind nipped at his face, and he tucked his gloved hands under his arms, scanning the tree line. He caught a glimpse of motion again, near the woodpile this time. Curiosity clashed with caution. Whoever was skulking around might be in trouble, or they might pose a threat. Summoning courage, Warren raised his voice. "Hello, if you need help, say something." The only response was the howling wind. He took a few tentative steps forward, leaving footprints that overlapped those of the mysterious intruder. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. Had news spread about the wolves? Could someone be searching for them? Or planning harm? When no answer came, he decided to circle around the cabin to check for damage or signs of forced entry. The snow crunched underfoot, every sound amplified in the crisp air. The path led him past the woodpile, where he noticed fresh gouges in the bark of a nearby tree. As he leaned in to inspect, a sudden voice made him whirl around. "Are they inside?" a woman's voice demanded, low and urgent. She was bundled in a heavy parka, her face partially concealed by a hood and scarf. Only her eyes were visible, intense, worried eyes that flickered toward the cabin's door. Warren raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Who are you?" he asked, attempting to keep his tone calm despite the jolt of surprise. Her gaze narrowed. "I'm hunting those wolves," she said, as though it were obvious. "They belong to a nearby pack. They went missing, and I've been tracking them for days." The statement startled Warren. "Hunting them," he echoed, his pulse quickening. Fear for the wolves gripped him. Was this woman intent on harming them, or could she be a ranger or researcher? She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud. "Not like that," she clarified, as if reading his expression. "I'm trying to help them. I'm with a wildlife rehabilitation group. We've been monitoring this pack for a while, especially these two." Her voice softened with concern. "The smaller one's been injured and separated from the group. They won't survive out here alone. Relief flooded Warren, yet suspicion lingered. Why not come to my door instead of skulking around? The woman glanced away, embarrassed. I wasn't sure what I'd find. I had to confirm they were here. People can be unpredictable when it comes to wolves. Warren couldn't argue with that. Come inside, he offered, gesturing toward the cabin, but move slowly. They're skittish, and I don't want them to feel threatened. Leading her inside, Warren braced himself for potential conflict. The larger wolf, sensing the newcomer, let out a warning bark, placing itself between the woman and the injured companion. The woman carefully removed her hood and scarf, revealing tired but determined features. She crouched, extending her hands palms up in a sign of peace. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured. "It's okay. I'm a friend." Her soothing tone was reminiscent of a vet or an experienced wildlife handler. Slowly, she inched closer, her eyes never leaving the wolf's. Warren watched in awe as the creature, after some hesitation, allowed her nearer. "Her name's Kara, by the way," the woman said over her shoulder, sensing Warren's watchful curiosity. "I'm a field researcher at the North Ridge Wildlife Center." Kara's calm demeanor seemed to reassure the wolves. She examined the smaller one's bandaged leg, nodding approvingly at Warren's efforts. "You did a good job cleaning this up," she said, her voice laced with admiration. "Might have saved its life." Warren exhaled a breath he'd been holding. "I was just trying to help," he said softly. Kara explained that the pack these wolves came from had been understudy due to dwindling numbers in the region. The smaller wolf, she revealed, was a young female who'd likely been injured by a trap or a territorial fight. The larger wolf was a close sibling, practically her only family. The pair had gone missing during a blizzard, and the research team feared the worst until Kara picked up their tracks. As she spoke, the wolves relaxed visibly, their posture easing as though they recognized her scent or voice. Warren felt a swell of relief, and a stab of sadness, too. He realized that their time with him might be nearing its end. The wolves needed professional care, and ultimately, they needed to return to the wild where they belonged. "You're going to take them back to your center?" Warren asked quietly. Kara nodded. "We have an enclosure where we can treat her leg properly. Once she's healed, we'll release them back into their territory." She paused, shooting him a kind look. "Of course, only if you're okay with that. They're on your property, after all." Warren glanced at the wolves. A strange pang twisted in his chest. He'd grown unexpectedly attached in such a short time. But he knew what he had to do. "It's what's best for them, right?" "It is," Kara confirmed gently. "They're wild creatures. They'll thrive once they're healthy and can rejoin their pack." In that moment, Warren felt the weight of compassion and responsibility clash. He wanted to keep them safe under his roof forever, to shield them from the harsh realities beyond his cabin walls. Yet he understood that real freedom, real survival, meant returning to the land they knew. Standing, he offered Kara a tight smile. "Then let's do what needs to be done," he said. "I'll help in any way I can." Kara's presence brought a sudden shift to the dynamic in Warren's cabin. For the wolves, she was a familiar figure, someone whose scent and demeanor they recognized as safe, if not entirely trusted. For Warren, she was an unexpected solution to a looming dilemma: how to provide the animals with the care they needed without compromising their wild nature. After the initial introductions, Kara set down her gear in a corner of the cabin and approached the smaller wolf. She examined the bandaged leg with a practiced touch, her brow furrowing at the signs of swelling. "It's not infected," she remarked, glancing at Warren, "but she'll need proper treatment at our facility. You did well with what you had." Warren felt a mixture of relief and pride. He noticed how gently Kara interacted with the wolves, speaking in a soothing tone, her posture non-threatening. The larger wolf observed her carefully, occasionally letting out a low whine as if voicing concern for its companion. "This must be her sibling," Kara said, nodding at the watchful guardian. "Wolves form strong family bonds. If she's injured, he won't leave her side." Warren gave a thoughtful nod. Over the past couple of days, he'd witnessed that bond firsthand. The bigger wolf had consistently shielded the smaller one, sharing its meager warmth during those cold, stormy nights. With evening approaching, Warren proposed they stay in the cabin one more night before attempting to transport the wolves. Kara agreed, noting the need to keep the stress on the animals as low as possible. She suggested they gradually acclimate them to being in a carrier or a vehicle, if they could arrange one nearby. "I have a snowmobile," Warren offered. "It could help us reach your team faster, or carry them part of the way if the roads are impassable." Kara's face lit up with gratitude. "That would be perfect. My truck's parked a few miles out, but the snow's too deep to drive it here safely." They spent the next hour discussing logistics. The plan was for Kara to radio her colleagues at dawn. They'd prepare a safe enclosure at the wildlife center, and Warren would help transport the wolves over the snowy terrain. It sounded straightforward, but Warren knew the wilderness rarely cooperated with human plans. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin took on a gentle glow from the fire. The two wolves, calmer now, rested side by side, their breathing slow and steady. Kara observed them with a tender gaze. "I've tracked them for months," she said quietly. "They used to run with a pack of about 6, but then we lost their signals during a blizzard, and I feared the worst." Warren poked at the embers in the fireplace, a pang of empathy tugging at him. They must have been separated somehow. "It's a miracle they found me, nor that I found them." Kara nodded. "Wolves are highly social. Being cut off from their pack can be a death sentence, especially for an injured member. It's amazing they survived this long." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics: her life as a researcher, Warren's quiet existence in the remote cabin, the challenges of living in such unforgiving conditions. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt both peaceful and eerie. Every so often, the wolves shifted or let out a soft exhale, reminding Warren of their presence and the delicate trust they had offered him. Before turning in for the night, Warren set out food for the wolves once more. Kara, cautious but intrigued, observed his method. She was impressed by how at ease the animals seemed around him. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice laced with admiration. "Most wolves would be too terrified or aggressive to enter a human's home like this, but they clearly sense your goodwill." Warren flushed slightly, not accustomed to such praise. "I couldn't just leave them to freeze," he mumbled. "They were desperate, and I guess I was too." "Too?" Kara echoed, curiosity in her eyes. Warren hesitated, then gave a half smile. "Living out here alone can be tough. Maybe in a strange way, I needed them as much as they needed me." During the night, the wind picked up again, howling around the cabin. The structure groaned under the gusts, and snow pelted the windows. Warren and Kara woke at intervals to check on the wolves, who, despite the commotion, slept in relative calm. The larger wolf would occasionally lift its head, ears alert, as though scanning for danger. Each time, it relaxed after a moment, perhaps realizing it was finally safe. By the time morning arrived, grey light filtered through the frosted windows. Kara rubbed the sleep from her eyes, yawning. "I'll try to reach my colleagues now," she said, pulling out a compact radio from her gear. She stepped outside, braving the biting cold to find a clearer signal. Warren started a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin. The wolves stirred, blinking slowly. The smaller one's bandaged leg seemed to have improved slightly, though it still showed signs of swelling. Warren offered them fresh water, quietly marveling at how natural it felt to care for these wild creatures. When Kara returned, her expression was a mix of relief and urgency. "They're sending help," she announced. "2 of my team members can meet us at a rendezvous point about 3 miles from here, near a frozen creek. If we can get the wolves there, they'll transport them the rest of the way." Warren nodded. "Then we'd better pack up. The snowmobile can handle 2 people and the wolves, if we're careful." Kara agreed, and they began gathering the necessary supplies. They rigged a makeshift sled to attach behind the snowmobile, lining it with blankets so the injured wolf could lie comfortably. The larger wolf, though wary of the contraption, seemed to sense it was necessary and sniffed at it without protest. The final hurdle was coaxing the wolves outside and into the sled. Warren decided to go first, opening the cabin door to a world of glistening white. A chill wind swept in, ruffling the wolves' fur. Kara led the way, speaking softly, using gentle gestures. The smaller wolf whimpered as it was lifted into the sled, but the bandage and ointment must have offered some relief, for it didn't fight too fiercely. The larger wolf hopped up on its own, nestling protectively against its sibling. With the wolves secured, Warren climbed onto the snowmobile, and Kara settled in behind him, holding a radio in her hand. The engine roared to life, echoing across the silent expanse. As they pulled away from the cabin, Warren felt a pang of mixed emotion. Part of him was reluctant to leave this temporary haven, where man and wolf had coexisted in such an extraordinary way. But he knew this journey was essential, for the wolves' sake, and perhaps for his own. The snowmobile carved a track through the endless white, its engines growl the only sound in a world muffled by ice and snow. Warren led the way, gripping the handlebars firmly while Kara sat behind him, keeping a watchful eye on the makeshift sled tethered behind them. Inside the sled, the two wolves huddled together, the smaller one's bandaged leg tucked close, the larger wolf protectively curled around its sibling. They aimed to reach the frozen creek, a rendezvous point where Kara's colleagues would be waiting. The journey would span roughly 3 miles, a distance that felt both too short and perilously long. While the sun offered a faint warmth, the Alaskan winter remained unforgiving, and a stiff breeze carried flecks of snow that stung any exposed skin. As they traversed the rugged terrain, Kara frequently glanced down at her radio, checking for updates from her team. The signal crackled occasionally, distorted by the thick forest and the looming mountains. "They said they'd meet us in about an hour," Kara announced, raising her voice over the wind. "We need to keep a steady pace." Warren nodded, focusing on guiding the snowmobile around drifts and hidden rocks. Every so often, he glanced back to ensure the wolves weren't too jostled by the bumpy ride. The larger wolf's ears twitched at every turn, but it seemed to trust that Warren and Kara meant no harm. 10 minutes into the journey, the sky began to change. A bank of steel-gray clouds gathered on the horizon, hinting at an approaching storm. Warren felt a twinge of worry. Traveling in a snowstorm, especially with injured wildlife in tow, was a risk he'd hoped to avoid. "Let's pick up speed," he said, turning his head slightly so Kara could hear. She agreed, tapping him on the shoulder to signal she'd brace for the jolts. The sled thumped against icy ridges, sending small snow showers cascading over the wolves. They whimpered, but neither attempted to leap out, perhaps understanding this was their best chance. The forest thickened, and visibility deteriorated as the trees closed in. Warren slowed the snowmobile, carefully weaving around trunks and low-hanging branches weighed down by snow. A wrong move could topple them or damage the sled. "We're close to the creek," Kara noted, checking a small handheld GPS. "If we follow the tree line, we should see it soon." Before long, they emerged into a wide clearing. The creek, frozen solid, gleamed under the weak sunlight. Its surface was littered with blown snow, making it look like a smooth, icy road. "We should cross here," Kara suggested. "My team should be on the far bank." Warren eased the snowmobile onto the ice, testing its stability. The ice groaned faintly but held firm. As they glided across, he couldn't help but marvel at the harsh beauty of the landscape, pristine, silent, and vast. Yet with every passing minute, the dark clouds crept closer, casting an ominous shadow over the distant peaks. Halfway across the creek, the radio crackled to life. "Kara, this is Dan," came a muffled voice. "We're approaching from the east, but the storm's moving in faster than expected. You might have to hunker down if it hits before we reach you." Kara exchanged a worried glance with Warren. "Copy that, Dan," she replied. "So we're crossing the creek now. Should reach the far side soon. Where exactly will you be?" "Look for a red marker on a pine," Dan's voice crackled. "We'll set up a temporary shelter there." As if on cue, the wind began to howl, blowing gusts of snow across the ice. Visibility dropped further, and Warren fought to keep the snowmobile steady. The wolves, sensing the shifting atmosphere, let out anxious whines. The smaller one whimpered, shivering from either cold or fear, or both. Kara placed a calming hand on Warren's shoulder. "Just a little further," she encouraged. "We'll find that marker." They reached the creek's far side, where the tree line resumed, looming like silent sentinels. The wind whipped snow into their faces, making it hard to see. Warren squinted, scanning the trunks for any sign of red. At last, Through the swirling white, he spotted a faint splash of color on a tall pine. Relief flooded him as he guided the snowmobile toward it. Sure enough, beneath the pine stood a half-erected shelter, two people in thick winter gear struggling to secure tarps against the relentless wind. A small fire crackled nearby, offering a beacon of heat. Kara waved frantically, and the figures turned, raising their arms in greeting. Once the snowmobile drew close, Warren killed the engine. Kara jumped off, speaking rapidly to her colleagues over the roar of the wind. "We found them," she said, jerking her thumb toward the sled. "They're weak but stable. The smaller one's got a leg injury." Dan, tall with a salt and pepper beard, nodded grimly. "Let's get them under shelter," he said. His companion, a short woman named Nina, hurried to lay out thick blankets inside the makeshift camp. "That storm's about to hammer us," Nina warned, her voice tight with urgency. Together, they carefully coaxed the wolves out of the sled. The larger wolf growled low in its throat when Dan approached, but Kara's soothing presence helped keep it calm. The smaller wolf, shaking from cold and stress, allowed Nina to guide it onto the blankets. Warren hovered protectively, ready to intervene if the animals spooked. With the wolves tucked into the relative warmth of the tarps and fire, the team set about stabilizing the area for the looming storm. Dan hurried to stake down additional lines, while Nina arranged supplies for the wolves. A proper first aid kit, sterile bandages, and sedatives if needed. Warren, now somewhat of an onlooker, felt a wave of mixed emotions. Relief that the wolves were finally in expert hands, but also a surprising pang of loss. For days, they had been under his sole care, forging an extraordinary bond. He couldn't ignore the flicker of sadness that they might no longer need him once they were healed and back with their pack. Kara sensed his unease. As she helped Nina check the smaller wolf's leg, she glanced over at Warren. "We'll make sure they get the best care," she promised softly. "And once they're ready, we can talk about how to release them. Maybe you could even be there." Warren managed a grateful smile, nodding. "I'd like that," he murmured. The wind picked up, rattling the tarps ominously, but inside this small camp by the creek he felt a warmth that transcended the fire, a warmth born of compassion, cooperation, and a newfound respect for these majestic, vulnerable creatures. The wind grew fiercer, rattling the makeshift shelter and forcing Dan and Nina to reinforce the ropes and tarps. The sky overhead had darkened ominously, and the temperature dropped further, signaling that the storm was nearly upon them. Warren stood at the edge of the small enclosure, watching as ice crystals swirled around them like a malevolent dance. Inside, the two wolves lay on thick blankets, their breath visible in the chill air. The smaller wolf's injured leg had been rebandaged with sterile dressings, and a mild sedative had calmed its shivers. The larger wolf remained alert, eyes darting between the humans, ready to defend its sibling if needed. Every so often, it let out a low, anxious whine as gusts of wind buffeted the tarps. Kara knelt beside them, checking the bindings around the smaller wolf's limb. She spoke softly, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "We need to wait this storm out before moving them," she told the group. "Traveling now would risk frostbite and injury, for them and for us." Warren nodded, though a flicker of worry crossed his face. Staying put meant relying on the hastily constructed shelter, with only a small fire and minimal supplies. "How long do these storms usually last?" he asked Dan, who was wrestling with a flapping corner of the tarp. "Could be hours, could be all night," Dan replied, his voice tense. "Alaskan weather is unpredictable at best." With no other choice, they set about making the shelter as secure as possible. Warren helped Nina stack snow around the perimeter to form a windbreak, while Dan and Kara set up a secondary tarp for added insulation. The wolves watched it all with quiet fascination, strange bipeds scurrying to protect them from nature's fury. Between tasks, Warren couldn't help but reflect on how surreal the situation was. Just days ago, he had been living in solitude, chopping wood and enduring the endless nights on his own. Now, he was part of a small, determined group fighting to save two wild wolves he'd grown fond of in a startlingly short time. Charlie, his old battered snowmobile, remained parked nearby, half buried in fresh drifts of snow. Warren casted a concerned glance, aware that if the storm worsened, retrieving any gear or making a quick escape might become impossible. The realization made his chest tighten with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. Eventually, as the storm peaked, the group huddled around a modest fire, built in a shallow pit to keep sparks from flying. The flames offered scant warmth, but it was enough to keep extremities from going numb. Dan and Nina took turns feeding the flames with small sticks and branches collected from under nearby evergreens. The wolves rested, their eyes half closed, lulled by the fire's soft crackling and the gentle murmur of human voices. Kara periodically checked the smaller wolf's pulse and breathing, ensuring the sedative hadn't caused any adverse effects. "She's stable," Kara confirmed, exhaling a breath of relief. "Let's just hope her body can fight off any infection until we get her proper medical attention." Warren gently stroked the larger wolf's flank, a tentative gesture of comfort. To his surprise, the wolf didn't flinch. It even leaned slightly into his touch, as though acknowledging the kindness. "You're one brave soul," Warren murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Both of you are." As night descended, the wind raged on, howling with renewed intensity. The temperature plummeted further, and the group found themselves in a battle for survival. Sleep was a luxury none could fully indulge in. Someone always had to keep an eye on the fire and ensure the tarps didn't tear or collapse under the gale. During one of his shifts, Warren noticed the larger wolf pacing restlessly around the smaller one. The sedative's effect was evident. The injured wolf breathed calmly in a deep sleep. Yet the siblings' concern was palpable. It nudged the sleeping wolf gently with its muzzle, letting out soft whines as if to say, "I'm here, don't worry." The sight tugged at Warren's heart. In the wolf's quiet communication, he saw parallels to human devotion and compassion. These animals, often painted as ruthless predators, displayed a love and loyalty that defied stereotypes. It reminded him of why he'd taken them in to begin with. They were more than just savage creatures. They were beings capable of tenderness and grief, just like humans. Sometime past midnight, the storm reached its apex. Snow fell in thick sheets, and the shelter quivered under the onslaught. Kara and Nina worked frantically to brace the windward side, driving stakes deeper into the frozen ground. Dan called out instructions, his voice nearly lost in the tempest. Warren helped where he could, though his fingers quickly went numb despite his gloves. The wolves grew agitated by the commotion, the larger one baring its teeth whenever a gust sent the tarp flapping too close. Kara spoke softly to it, maintaining eye contact and using a calming tone. "Easy there," she whispered, slowly extending her hand. "We're just keeping you safe." Eventually, the storm seemed to relent. The wind died down to a more manageable roar, and the snowfall lightened to a gentle swirl. Dan poked his head out from the shelter's entrance, scanning the horizon with a flashlight. "It's easing up," he announced, relief evident in his voice. "We might be able to move by morning if it continues to let up." Gradually, the group allowed themselves brief moments of rest. Warren settled beside the wolves, leaning his back against a wooden support post. The larger wolf, still restless, finally lay down close to him, resting its head on its paws. Warren felt a faint smile tug at his lips. It was extraordinary how quickly trust could form under such dire circumstances. He glanced over at the sleeping smaller wolf, marveling at its resilience. Despite the freezing cold, the injury, and all it had endured, it slept with an almost serene look. Warren whispered a silent promise. "You'll be okay. We'll make sure of it." The night wore on, and by the time dawn's grey light filtered through the clouds, the storm had passed. A silence more profound than any they had known in the past days settled over the creek. Snowdrifts reached waist-height in some places, glinting under the pale sunrise. Kara roused herself to check on her radio, while Nina stoked the remnants of the fire. Warren sat up, stretching stiff limbs. The wolves stirred, blinking groggily. It was time to see if they could finish their journey, one that would lead to healing and eventually freedom for these regal creatures of the wild. Morning arrived with an eerie stillness, as though the land itself was recovering from the storm's fury. Sunlight glinted off the snow, creating a dazzling display of white and gold that contrasted sharply with the grim ordeal of the previous night. Warren felt a certain relief. The storm was over, and they could finally move forward with the wolves. Yet, a nagging anxiety kept tugging at him. some instinct warning him that their challenges weren't over. Kara's radio crackled to life, and she answered it eagerly. Dan, Nina, you copy. The storm's cleared. How's your location? She paused, listening. Warren couldn't catch the exact words, but he saw Kara's shoulders tense. Turning to him, Kara said softly, Dan reports that while the weather's improved, we've got a new problem. The road leading to the wildlife center is blocked by fallen branches and ice. They're working to clear it, but it could take hours, maybe a day. Warren exhaled, the news settling like a weight on his chest. So we're stuck here for a while. Then, the wolves can't travel safely on foot with one injured, and the snowmobile won't get us to the center if the main roads are blocked. Kara nodded. We'll have to hunker down until Dan and Nina finish clearing the route. We can't risk taking the wolves on an alternate path. Too much deep snow, and we'd only stress them further. Despite the setback, the small group remained resolute. They replenished the fire, checked the wolves' condition, and discussed how best to manage the weight. The larger wolf paced nervously, occasionally sniffing the air outside the makeshift shelter, as if searching for something familiar. The smaller wolf rested with half-closed eyes, better after the sedative but still clearly in pain. Kara, Warren asked at one point, do you think they sense their pack might be near, or are they just anxious? She considered his question. Wolves have powerful instincts for tracking pack members. It's possible they can sense a distant scent or a familiar territory. But given the storm's aftermath, any scent trails could be lost. Restlessness and concern weighed on them as the hours ticked by. Warren, unaccustomed to such prolonged inactivity, volunteered to scout the immediate area for more firewood. Kara agreed it was a good idea, so long as he stayed within sight of the shelter. Don't go too far, she cautioned. The snow's deep, and we don't want to lose you if the weather turns again. Arming himself with warm clothes and a sturdy shovel, Warren ventured a short distance away from the creek. The landscape, cloaked in fresh snow, was both stunning and treacherous. Each step sank knee-deep, forcing him to conserve energy. Still, he managed to gather enough fallen branches to keep the fire going through another cold night. On his return trip, however, something caught his attention, a faint set of tracks leading away from the creek's bank. They weren't large enough for a moose, nor small enough for rabbits or foxes. His heart quickened, suspecting they might be wolf tracks. But were they from his two wards, or another animal entirely? Curiosity prodded him forward. He followed the tracks for a short while, noticing the stride seemed uneven, as if the wolf, if it was a wolf, was limping. Could it be another injured member of the same pack? Or perhaps the smaller wolf had wandered around before he'd taken it in? The question swirled, fueling his sense of urgency. A sudden gust of wind lifted the surface snow, stinging his face and blurring his vision. Warren realized he had strayed farther than intended. The shelter was now out of sight. He glanced back, orienting himself by a crooked pine he'd passed minutes earlier. Better to head back before he got lost or the weather shifted again. But as he turned, he caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. A flash of gray fur among the trees. His breath caught. Another wolf. He carefully laid down the bundle of wood, not wanting to appear threatening. "Hello," he murmured, aware of how absurd it sounded to greet a wild creature. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this wolf might be connected to the pair he was sheltering. The figure slinked closer, staying behind the trunk of a gnarled birch. Warren caught sight of a thin muzzle, tall ears, and a patchy coat, definitely a wolf, but in rough shape. It observed him warily, as if uncertain whether to approach or flee. Warren stood still, adopting the same calm posture he'd used with the injured wolf in his cabin. Minutes passed in a standoff of sorts. Finally, the wolf took a tentative step forward. Warren could now see it was severely underweight, its fur matted with ice. It held its head low, not in a submissive manner but in exhaustion. A pang of compassion resonated within him. How many wolves out here were fighting a losing battle against the relentless winter? He recalled Kara's mention of a pack. Was this yet another separated member? The idea tugged at him. If they could reunite these wolves, perhaps they'd all stand a better chance. Then, abruptly, the wolf growled, a deep rumble that startled Warren. It bared its teeth, though it appeared too weak to truly threaten. Warren instinctively raised his arms, palms out, showing he had no weapon. "Easy," he whispered, heart thudding. But the wolf's eyes flicked past him, focusing on something behind him. Warren risked a glance over his shoulder, seeing only snow-covered branches and the tracks he'd left. The wolf's growl intensified, then it bolted, disappearing among the pines with surprising agility for its emaciated frame. A swirl of confusion and unease settled over Warren. Why had it run, and what had spooked it? Clutching his bundle of wood, he headed back to the shelter, the entire encounter replaying in his mind. When he returned, Kara spotted the troubled look on his face. "Everything okay?" she asked as he deposited the wood near the fire. Warren explained what he'd seen. Kara listened intently, her expression growing pensive. Another lone wolf, injured or starving, could be part of the same pack, or it might be a rogue. Either way, it's risky to follow it without backup. He nodded in agreement. "I couldn't just walk away, though. It looked so desperate." "I know," Kara said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Warren's shoulder. "But we have to think about the ones here first. Once we stabilize them, maybe we can investigate that wolf. For now, we can't endanger ourselves or them." Warren glanced at the wolves resting under the tarps, emotions roiling in his chest. The wilderness was merciless, and he couldn't save every creature alone. Yet the thought of any wolf wandering out there, half dead and separated from its family, stoked a fervent determination within him. The hours crept by under the makeshift shelter, the newly fallen snow draped over the landscape like a silencer over any distant sound. Warren and Kara alternated between tending the wolves and stoking the fire, while Dan and Nina attempted to clear a path to the main road. Each radio update revealed only partial success. Fallen branches and drifts continued to impede their progress. Yet Warren's thoughts kept returning to the third wolf he'd glimpsed in the woods. Its gaunt form, the fearful glint in its eyes, something about that encounter nagged at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the lone animal might be related to the pair he'd rescued, possibly another separated family member. Meanwhile, the two wolves under the shelter showed signs of improvement. The smaller one, though still in pain, could now shift positions on the blankets without whimpering. Its sibling kept a watchful stance, occasionally licking the bandaged leg as if trying to offer comfort. Kara provided careful doses of painkillers, explaining that while they helped, they also made the wolf groggy and off balance. "I just wish we could get them to our center sooner," Kara muttered, staring at the storm-ravaged terrain. "They need a proper enclosure, regular feeding, and a stress-free environment." Warren understood her concern. "They've come a long way," he said softly, "but I'm worried about that other wolf out there, too." Kara gave him a pensive look. "It could be from the same pack, or a different one altogether. We can't risk losing the progress we've made here by wandering off on a rescue mission we're not prepared for." Warren nodded, yet the image of the lone wolf lingered. Late that afternoon, Dan's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got a partial opening on the road. If we push hard, we might clear enough to get a vehicle through by tomorrow morning. Think you can hold out until then?" Kara responded affirmatively. "We're good here, Dan. The wolves are stable. Just hurry if you can." She glanced at Warren and offered a reassuring nod. Relief washed over him. One more night, and they could finally move the wolves to safer ground. He turned to the animals, stroking the larger wolf's thick fur. "Just hold on," he murmured. "Help's coming." However, that sense of relief proved short-lived. Near dusk, as the sky took on a bruised purple hue, the hair on the larger wolf's neck bristled. It stood abruptly, ears swiveling, eyes fixed on the tree line. The smaller wolf stirred, letting out a questioning whine. "What spooked them now?" Nina asked, tensing. Kara picked up her binoculars and peered through the dim light, scanning the forest edge. "There's movement out there," she said. "Can't tell if it's a person or an animal." A cold knot formed in Warren's stomach. "Might be that lone wolf I saw." Before anyone could respond, the larger wolf let out a sharp bark, then stepped off the blankets, limping slightly as it moved toward the shelter's exit. Warren stood, blocking its path. "Easy," he said, arms raised. "We can't have you running off now." The wolf growled softly, not in aggression but in anxiety. It looked back at its smaller sibling, then at Warren, as if torn between duty and caution. A pang of empathy struck him. The wolf likely sensed a familiar scent, possibly that of a pack member. Kara's radio crackled again, startling everyone. "Kara, urgent update," Dan's voice came through. "We've spotted another wolf near the road. Looks weak. It might be trying to head your way." Warren's heart leapt. "That has to be it," he blurted, turning to Kara. "The third wolf. It's coming this direction." Kara frowned, exchanging a look with Nina. "We can't let it wander close, injured and alone, without at least trying to help," she said. "But we also can't abandon these two." Frustration welled in Warren's chest. "I'll go," he offered, surprising even himself. "You stay here with them." "That wolf could be part of their pack." Nina looked skeptical. "You're just one person. What if it's too frightened or too far gone?" "I won't do anything reckless," Warren insisted, "but I can't leave it out there to freeze. I'll take Charlie, my snowmobile, and see if I can intercept it." Kara hesitated, scanning the expressions of the group. "All right," she finally agreed, voice tinged with concern. "But keep your radio on. If you run into trouble, call us. We'll do what we can." Warren packed quickly, donning multiple layers of warm clothing and securing a small first aid kit. He checked the fuel in his snowmobile, enough for a short trek, as long as he didn't stray too far. "I'll look around for a while. If I don't find it or if things get dicey, I'll come straight back." The two wolves watched him go, the smaller one letting out a low whine as if sensing another departure. Warren paused to give it a final pat. "I'll be back," he promised. As he mounted his snowmobile and revved the engine, the larger wolf let out a howl, a forlorn, echoing note that resonated against the snow. Warren shivered at its haunting beauty. "Hang tight," he murmured, steering away from the shelter. The twilight deepened as he navigated the snowy terrain, guided by footprints and half-remembered landmarks. Dan's report suggested the lone wolf was near the partially cleared road, so Warren aimed for that route, mindful of drifts and hidden ice. Each roar of the engine felt jarring against the otherwise silent wilderness. At last, he spotted movement near a stand of spruce trees. Cutting the engine, he dismounted and grabbed his flashlight. He advanced cautiously, heart pounding. The silhouette of a wolf emerged, thin, limping, its ribcage alarmingly visible. It let out a faint growl when Warren came within a few yards. "I'm not here to hurt you," Warren said, pitching his voice low. He recognized the same hollow eyes and trembling frame he'd witnessed in the first two wolves. This one looked even more desperate, as though it had reached the very brink of survival. "Your family's nearby. Let me help." The wolf staggered, collapsing onto its haunches. A wave of pity surged through Warren as he closed the gap. From behind a spruce trunk, another figure emerged, Dan, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Easy," he cautioned. "We don't want it to bolt." Warren nodded, relieved for the backup. He knelt in the snow, offering his hand in that now familiar gesture of peace. Would the wolf sense his sincerity, or would it lash out in fear? The wolf lifted its head, eyes reflecting the faint glow of Warren's flashlight. For a heartbeat, man and beast shared a silent communion, the swirling snow momentarily forgotten. Warren knelt in the snow, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. The third wolf, a ragged specter of the wild, lay exhausted before him, its breath shallow. Dan stood a few paces behind, rifle slung but ready. The air crackled with tension, as though the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see whether this desperate creature would accept or reject the help being offered. "Easy there," Warren murmured, inching closer. His outstretched hand trembled slightly, a testament to the emotional stakes. He was no trained wildlife expert like Kara, but empathy and instinct guided him. A swirl of wind caught the edges of his coat, carrying his scent toward the wolf. The animal's nostrils flared, and it let out a low, haunted whine. For a moment, Warren glimpsed a flicker in the wolf's tired eyes, recognition, perhaps, or some faint memory of safety. Then it slumped, too weak to resist or flee. Gathering his courage, Warren carefully laid a blanket he'd brought over the creature, speaking in soft murmurs. "You're all right," he said, wishing his words could truly penetrate the wolf's fear. "We'll get you to your family." Dan approached slowly, scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of danger. "We should get it back to Kara," he whispered. "If we're lucky, this wolf might be the missing piece of the puzzle." Warren nodded. He gently lifted the wolf's head, amazed at how light it felt despite its size. The poor animal must have been starving for weeks. "Let's move it carefully," he instructed, glancing at Dan. "I'll hold the front. You support the hindquarters." Between the two of them, they maneuvered the limp wolf onto a sled they'd brought, one similar to the makeshift contraption Warren had used for the other two. The wolf whimpered softly, but its exhaustion seemed to overshadow any remaining fight. Once secured, Dan took the lead, towing the sled behind his own snowmobile, while Warren followed on Charlie, his battered old machine. The journey back to the temporary shelter proved both tense and bittersweet. On one hand, Warren's heart soared at the prospect of reuniting this lone wolf with the injured pair. On the other, he worried about how they would react. Wolves had intricate social hierarchies, and there was no guarantee the newcomer would be welcomed. Yet he clung to hope, recalling the devotion he'd witnessed among the two wolves in his cabin. By the time they arrived, dusk was falling. The sky was painted with streaks of lavender and orange, a rare beauty that offered a momentary reprieve from the biting cold. Kara rushed to meet them, eyes wide with concern. "You found it?" she asked, incredulity etched in her voice. Warren dismounted, nodding. "It's in bad shape, but alive." Together, they guided the sled into the shelter. The two wolves inside stirred immediately. The larger one's ears shot up, and it let out a sharp bark that echoed in the confines of the tarp. The smaller wolf, still recovering, lifted its head in confusion. Kara positioned herself between the newcomer and the pair, just in case. A tense hush fell over the group as Warren and Kara carefully unwrapped the blanket from around the third wolf. At first, the injured wolf seemed uneasy, barking and pacing. Then the newcomer raised its head, meeting the eyes of the larger wolf with an almost electric intensity. A soft, pleading whine followed, and the larger wolf's posture shifted from guarded aggression to sudden recognition. It closed the distance, sniffing the newcomer, ears flattening as though in empathy. The smaller wolf let out a low whimper, half rising on bandaged legs. All three wolves seemed locked in a silent conversation, their bodies communicating in ways words never could. Kara exhaled, relief visible in her posture. They know each other. Look at how they're greeting. No snarling, no hackles raised. This is definitely part of their family unit. Warren felt tears sting his eyes. To witness such a raw, intimate moment among wild creatures was humbling. He found himself stepping back, giving the wolves space to reaffirm their bonds. The third wolf, despite its weakness, managed to nuzzle the injured sibling's muzzle, a slow, tender gesture that spoke volumes. The larger wolf hovered protectively, ensuring every move was peaceful. Soon the three wolves nestled together on the blankets, a small pack reunited. Their soft whines and licks seemed to reassure one another. "We're here. We survived." For Warren and the others, it was a moment of collective awe, overshadowing the hardships of the preceding days. "You did it," Kara whispered to Warren, her gaze flicking to the sled. "If you hadn't gone out there, that wolf might have perished alone in the snow." He shrugged, overwhelmed by emotion. "We all did this, really. I had to try." Their reverie was broken by the crackle of Kara's radio. Dan's voice, urgent. "Road is finally clear enough for a truck. We're on our way to your location. 20 minutes, tops." Everyone sprang into action. The wolves needed safe transport, and with the family now complete, the mission took on an even deeper significance. Nina prepared sedatives in case the wolves panicked during the journey. Warren offered to help load them, though his heart clenched at the thought of letting them go. When Dan and Nina arrived with a sturdy vehicle, the group carefully moved the three wolves into large unpadded crates. The newcomer put up the most resistance, but with gentle coaxing and mild sedation, they settled down. The reunited pack maintained visual contact through the crate's mesh, their gazes filled with what Warren could only interpret as trust and resignation, knowing, somehow, this was part of their path to recovery. Under the glow of headlights, Warren stood with Kara, watching as Dan secured the crates. Snow glistened underfoot, a quiet witness to a moment that felt both victorious and bittersweet. "You're welcome to visit them at the center," Kara said. "They'll need time to heal and adjust, but once we're sure they can handle it, we'll release them back into the wild." Warren nodded, swallowing hard. "I'd like that," he managed, his voice thick. "I need to see them free, where they belong." Kara smiled softly. "And I'm sure they'll be glad to see you too." The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the twilight. As the vehicle pulled away, Warren felt a tear slip down his cheek, tears of relief, gratitude, and an unexpected ache at their departure. He reminded himself this was the right outcome, a family reunited, given a second chance at survival. In the hush that followed, he whispered a final goodbye to the wolves, imagining their breath steaming in the cold, hearts beating in unison with the wild. Then, turning to Kara, he mustered a shaky smile. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Kara squeezed his arm. "No, thank you for giving them a chance and reminding us all why we do this." The days that followed felt strangely quiet for Warren. Gone were the soft whines and cautious footsteps that had filled his cabin, replaced by the familiar silence of the Alaskan wilderness. Yet, this silence no longer felt lonely. In the place of wolves and uncertainty, there was now a profound sense of peace and purpose. In the evenings, Warren found himself gazing at the horizon, recalling each moment he had shared with the three wolves. He remembered the trembling desperation of the first encounter, the hard-won trust, and the ultimate reunion that had brought them all together in a way he never anticipated. Thinking of them now, safe at Kara's Wildlife Center, gave him comfort. He trusted that, with proper care and healing, they'd soon return to the snowy forests they called home. True to her word, Kara stayed in touch. She sent updates, photos of the wolves recovering in a spacious enclosure, where they lounged in the sun and played in the snow. The smaller wolf's leg was healing, the bandages gradually coming off. The third wolf, once gaunt and fearful, was steadily regaining strength. Most importantly, the wolves were thriving as a united pack, their familial bond stronger than ever. Warren often pictured the day of their eventual release into the wild. He imagined standing at the edge of the tree line, watching them step forward, free, healthy, and together. Perhaps they would glance back just for a second, in acknowledgement of the man who offered them warmth and compassion when they needed it most. In the meantime, Warren returned to his routines, chopping wood, tending his small greenhouse, and fortifying his cabin against the relentless cold. But he did so with renewed wonder for the land he lived in. Where once he saw only the harshness of nature, he now recognized a deeper harmony, a delicate balance between survival and empathy. He kept extra blankets folded near his hearth, just in case, he told himself with a wry smile. If this story of unexpected compassion and a family of wolves reunited touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a bond between human and wild creature that challenged your assumptions? Share your experiences below. We'd love to hear them. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more stories that celebrate the unbreakable threads connecting us all. From the frozen forests to our own backyards, kindness can spark miracles where we least expect them.